very closely with the Centre for Dementia Prevention, and I'm also co-director of the Alzheimer's Scotland Dementia Research Centre, again here at the University of Edinburgh. As you'll discover over the next couple of days, there are lots of groups in Edinburgh working on dementia, and it's an area that the University of Edinburgh in particular, and all the universities in Edinburgh, are developing a very strong interest in, and we're doing our best to work together as much as possible. We're all of us very fond on collaborating internationally because it means we get to travel to exciting places, but we're also trying to collaborate within Edinburgh as much as possible. So welcome to Edinburgh. Hopefully you've had a little bit of a chance to see the proper city right in the middle. It really is beautiful, and certainly yesterday it was a fabulous day, perhaps less so today, but on a beautiful day there's almost nowhere better in the world. And obviously we're here in the UK, and we're here on the south side of Edinburgh, on the site of the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, which is where the Centre for Dementia Prevention building is housed. This is the only photograph I could find, and number one, just next to the big red arrow, where are we, is the building we're in at the moment, number 9, Bioquarter, and this field is now occupied next door by building 9A, which is the Centre for Dementia Prevention building. I like to point out that you can see a little bit of continental Europe in the corner of this map, and at the moment, I will always consider myself to be European, but at the moment we are still part of the European Union, though obviously who knows whether or not that will change at any point, but that's very important for a number of the projects that we're working on, which I'll come back to later. These are some pictures of some of the people in Edinburgh and some of the centres. So the two photographs on the left are of the Alzheimer's Scotland Dementia Research Centre. The man with the beard is John Starr, who is our director, celebrating with Henry Simmons, the chief executive of the charity Alzheimer's Scotland, funding our centre for another 5 years. And one of the developments during those 5 years has been the world's first dementia tartan, which is on the tartan registry, and ties and kilts and all sorts of things are available, and all the proceeds of the sales of the tartan go into dementia research. But we're really here to talk about the Centre for Dementia Prevention today. In the middle at the top you can see Professor Craig Ritchie, the director of the Centre for Dementia Prevention, standing with a member of the royal family who's the principal of the university who came to open our building. Here's some of the team, our opening lecture, and the lady with the red hair is a very important person because she's the first participant in the European Prevention of Alzheimer Dementia programme, which I'll come back to in a moment, but which is a large European-wide study coordinated from the Centre for Dementia Prevention. So at the risk of being a bit too general, I want to talk a little bit about the global importance of dementia, much of which I'm sure we're all familiar with, the evidence for preclinical changes in dementia, projections of the impact of prevention, because a lot of the efforts of the Centre for Dementia Prevention, as its name implies, is on prevention, and then talk a little bit about the centre in more detail. So firstly, this is a very familiar slide showing that globally the impact of dementia is huge at the moment, but it's set to grow enormously over the coming decades, and disproportionately so in low to middle income countries. Mainly, though not entirely, because of demographic changes. At the same time, in a number of European and North American countries, there have been reports of reducing prevalence or incidence of dementia. And these do seem to be a real phenomenon. It's been speculated that relates to cardiovascular disease prevention and increased education in more recent generations. But actually, demographic changes are going to dwarf any decrease in these rates, and numbers are going to increase massively. And risk factor profiles are changing, and in this country and in many others, there's large problems with obesity, particularly in the very young, and it may be that these things then alter these changes. This again is from the Alzheimer's Disease International report showing projections for the numbers of people with dementia over the coming decades, the green bars being high-income countries and the red bar being low to middle-income countries, showing the disproportionate growth. That dementia is going to become a global, even more of a global issue than it is currently. And particularly in high-income countries like Scotland, we've got to think about this problem globally. I've become very interested in geography, and much of my research focuses on geographical variation in dementia. We reviewed the literature a few years ago, and this was my favourite paper. It's from Bonavista Bay in Newfoundland in Canada, and this study was in fact very, very innovative, and they looked at death certificates for a couple of years and then found out where these people had been born. So each dot on this map is a person who died with dementia, but it's the location of where they were born. And if you're born on the north side of the bay, your risk of developing dementia, or dying with dementia in this case, was much, much higher than on the south side of the bay. And there was some evidence that this is linked to genetic factors. He looked at shared surnames as a kind of proxy for genetic relatedness, and that explained a little bit of this effect, but not all of it. It's not a solely genetic pattern. So I've been developing this initially in Sweden and in Scotland. The maps on the left are of Sweden, with men on the left and women on the right. And these are a fantastic Swedish twin registry that they have. And about 10 years ago, a group at the Karolinska Institute and the University of Southern California did an amazing study where they contacted every twin in Sweden over the age of 65 with initially a telephone interview, then invited anybody who seemed to have cognitive impairment and a sample of the normals to come in for a clinical assessment and ascertain their dementia status across the whole of the country, across the whole of the twin cohorts. Absolutely amazing piece of work. And I use these data in hierarchical disease mapping models. And because they're twins, I was able to factor out the genetic effects. So the variation in these maps is purely due to non-shared environmental factors. The colour coding is that the white areas are sort of roughly average risk, the orange fading into red is increased risk, and the green areas are at decreased risk. So again, there's a north-south pattern here, much more prominent in women than in men, and the size of this effect is that the risk in the north is about 2 to 3 times more than the risk in the south. And this is probably something environmental. The maps of Scotland are of the Scottish Mental Survey cohort 1932. So this is a narrow age cohort, all born in 1921, who sat an intelligence test at the age of 11. So we know what school they went to. And the top maps, which are entirely blank because there's no variation in risk, is based on the county of schooling, aged 11. So there's no variation in dementia risk where you live in early life, or at least at age 11. The maps at the bottom are based on tracing these people in later life, in their 60s, 70s and 80s. And there's a similar pattern of risk. I've enlarged the maps here slightly, including enlarging the central belt. So Edinburgh is this area here, and then Glasgow is this area here. Again, men on the left, women on the right. And there's a similar, not quite as clear, north-south pattern. Certainly as far north as Inverness, it seems that in the south, the risk is lower. In the middle, it's variable, but sort of average, increasing the further north you go. It's worth remembering that somewhere in the region of 2/3 of the population of Scotland live in this area called the Central Belt, Edinburgh and Glasgow and all the towns in between. So we're a very, the population isn't uniformly spread across the country. We've then repeated this in Italy using mortality data with a similar effect noted. Low in the south, sort of average in the middle, high in the north. In New Zealand, in the southern hemisphere, it wasn't quite as clear, possibly, and this is the New Zealand population of European descent to try and avoid any complications of differing genetic factors again. In women, it does seem a bit clearer that in South Island, the risk seems to be higher than in North Island. So the reverse pattern that we found in Sweden, Scotland, and Italy. So it may be that it's something to do with distance from the equator. Well, that's a possibility as well. It may be to do with that, absolutely. And so we're now exploring what this effect might be. I'm quite interested in sunlight and vitamin D, and so we thought we'd look at it in a long country. So we found similar data from colleagues in Chile, which didn't show such a nice effect as in New Zealand, but what it did show is in the capital, Santiago de Chile, which is blown up here, a generally increased risk. And one of the factors that's very pertinent to Santiago de Chile is the air quality there. There's an enormous amount of air pollution, which has led us to another area that we're going to look at. So thinking about the evidence for preclinical changes, during my PhD I did a study looking at the association between height and dementia. And this is a very UK-specific photograph, but this is from a comedy television programme in the 1960s with John Cleese, who went on to do Fawlty Towers, and Ronnie Barker and Ronnie Corbett, who had a series called The Two Ronnies. And it's a comment on the British social class system, that the upper class man looks down on the middle class man, and the middle class man looks down on the lower class man, and they all know their place. I found this doesn't always translate to international audiences, so I have a slightly dated but slightly more up-to-date slide, and that you can see that Obama is bigger than David Cameron. Even he has very tall hair, so there is in fact a height difference, and that David Cameron is taller than Putin. And the shorter you are, the more likely you are to develop dementia. Clearly that's not a causal association, but height is a marker of early life experience, psychosocial stress, nutrition, illness, all sorts of things. And so there's perhaps some socioeconomic explanation for this. And as a very rough marker, if you put the country's GDPs under these world leaders, you can see an association. So early life factors are important. And until recently, no study had linked birth parameters, whether it's length or birth weight or anything like that, with cognition or dementia in later life. This fantastic study from Iceland, the Reykjavik Ages study, did that. They measured, they linked birth weight with cognition 70 or 75 years later, and showed a real effect, that the smaller you are at birth, the more likely you are that your cognition is poorer in later life. And they drew this beautiful picture speculating all of the many and varied factors which might affect you over the life course. And this is really where all of our research is focused, thinking about life course influences on dementia. And so one thing that we're trying to popularise, which in some quarters is completely accepted, and particularly amongst my clinician colleagues is less so, is that actually dementia isn't a single entity that occurs in later life. It's something that develops over the life course, and there are influences across the life course that increase and decrease your risk. So preceding dementia, there's a stage of prodromal dementia, and prior to that, there are changes in the body that cause no symptoms. Preclinical Alzheimer's disease, for example. And at the different stages, different assessments are needed to identify that. So in the clinic, we tend to do a functional assessment. We find out how somebody is at home looking after themselves. Earlier in the disease, they're going to be unimpaired, and so biomarkers are going to be much more important. Our National Health Service is not set up for anything that would require biomarkers. Our clinics could not do lumbar punctures or have access to any of the complicated scans that are required for this sort of thing. So last year, Professor Ritchie and me and a group of experts from across the UK came up with the Edinburgh Consensus to try and start a conversation about how our health services would need to adapt if we had a disease-modifying treatment. Really, again, promulgating this model that dementia is preceded by a prodromal stage. On this slide, it's called mild cognitive impairment, which I don't particularly think is a helpful term, and preceded by a preclinical phase, which can last decades, when there are changes in the brain, and perhaps the body, but no symptoms. And this is a very well-known slide. I don't think it's a particularly clear figure, but it does show the idea that further back in time, there are biomarker changes which may or may not lead on to disease, but are going to be present at some point. And this is borne out by pathological studies which show much earlier in life, in unselected autopsy studies like this one, people in their 40s and even 30s have substantial and important changes, particularly in amyloid, but also in tau pathology. And this is matched by studies of cognition. These are cross-sectional data, they're not longitudinal, but it's a very innovative study done by the psychology department here in conjunction with the BBC, where through the BBC website, people were invited to take a number of cognitive tests, and they input their age, and they only allowed one data point from each IP address, so it's unlikely that one person will be represented more than once. And it shows that in almost all the cognitive tests, digit span is the most preserved. The general progress from really your 20s is downwards. So there is an element of cognitive decline way before we would think of anything like dementia. So can we do anything about that? Is it possible to intervene? So in reality, because the disease is present from midlife, what we're often describing in terms of interventions is secondary prevention. Somebody has a disease in their brain, we're wanting to prevent it becoming manifest. True primary prevention would have to begin very, very early, before the development of any Alzheimer-type pathology. And it's important to remember that risk factor associations may differ at different life stages. It's becoming clear that in later life, the associations between risk factors and dementia risk may be different. That actually, if you've survived to the age of 80 or 90, actually, it may not be particularly beneficial to have a low blood pressure at that stage, whereas earlier in life, that's very much to be encouraged. And I'm certainly of the conclusion that actually the presence of Alzheimer's disease in the brain isn't necessarily a problem. We know that many people die with moderate or severe Alzheimer's disease in their brain and absolutely no symptoms. But delaying the clinical onset of Alzheimer's dementia is very important, and this could have a substantial effect on disease numbers. And thinking back to the projections from Alzheimer's Disease International, this could have an impact globally. This is a very speculative slide. But it's estimating what could happen to the incidence of dementia if the onset could be delayed by 5 years. So the light green curve is where we are currently, and if the incidence of dementia could be delayed by 5 years, the darker green incidence curve is the one that would occur. And the area under the curves is a kind of indication of the number of people. So there's a massive difference between the two. So what are the risk factors? What can we do? So last year, Jill Livingston and a team from UCL published a Lancet Commission on dementia prevention, and they identified a number of risk factors. And there have been some methodological criticisms and some criticism of their assumptions, but it's still an excellent article. And they thought that at least a third of dementia risk was potentially modifiable. I'd argue that it's a bit more than that, because I don't think we fully understand dementia risk. I think there's probably about a third of the variance that is still unexplained. But they felt that in late life, smoking and depression and physical activity and social isolation and diabetes were important. Earlier in life, in midlife, hypertension and obesity were important. They thought that 9% of the population attributable fraction of dementia was associated with hearing loss in midlife. I think some of their assumptions about the prevalence of hearing loss in midlife were questionable, and it's worth remembering that hearing loss is a particular interest of Jill Livingston's, and so I think that's why she made it so prominent in her article. But also in early life, education attainment and the ApoE epsilon 4 allele is a particularly important non-modifiable risk factor. So I mentioned earlier Santiago de Chile. So I'm very interested in air pollution as a potential risk factor for cognitive decline and dementia. And I have some colleagues in Los Angeles where the air quality is substantially poorer than it is here in Edinburgh, particularly on the outskirts. And the group at the University of Southern California were recently the subject of a great really review article in Science, talking about the work that they've been doing. And the really innovative approach, which I particularly like, is that they publish side by side in the same article epidemiological work from large cohorts and basic science from animal models. And the complementary nature of that, I think, really makes it very convincing in terms of identifying the mechanism behind this association. It's not just a problem in Los Angeles. In London, this is last year, but Brixton Road, a very, very busy road in central London, breached its annual limits for air pollution within the first 5 days of the year. And even in a smaller city like Edinburgh, we're not immune. And there's talk of low emission zones and all sorts of things. But cars are a substantial part of it, at least in high income countries. Also burning fuels and these sorts of things are important. Just quickly, because I'm very interested in it, I'm interested in environmental factors in general, and at the moment I'm looking at aluminium, which has a long history of being linked with, a long and controversial history of being linked with dementia. I think the evidence for aluminium levels in drinking water is quite convincing. It seems to be pretty solid. But the World Health Organization feels that there's an acceptable level of aluminium in water, and it's often used in water treatment and these sorts of things. In Scotland, the levels are much, much lower. So the left shows a map of aluminium levels in drinking water, and the acceptable level that the World Health Organization has set is 100 micrograms per litre. It's nowhere in Scotland over 70. Nevertheless, even at these low, supposedly safe levels, there's a dose-response association between, well, it's maybe not so clearly dose-response, but certainly there's an association between higher levels of aluminium in drinking water and dementia risk. This is again in the Scottish Mental Survey 1932 cohort. So even at supposedly acceptable levels, there's still an association. So finally, just quickly about the Centre for Dementia Prevention, there are a number of studies that are run from the centre, and I couldn't possibly explain all of them, but I suppose the more significant ones are the Prevent Dementia cohort, which is a multi-site UK cohort study of adults in midlife, so from 40 to 80. And there's a balance between people who are at increased risk of dementia from having a first-degree relative with dementia and those who don't. The aim is it's recruiting at the moment, the aim is to recruit 700 people from the sites in Edinburgh, London, Oxford and Cambridge. It's just those four, is that right? At the moment. And it's currently recruiting Dublin. So UK and Ireland study, I have to remember that. Yes, I've got to be very correct with that. And there are preliminary studies coming out. These are people who have seen at baseline and then followed up, hopefully multiple times over a number of years, to see what the change in very sensitive cognitive tests, in biomarkers, are in people in midlife. So possibly some of whom may have preclinical Alzheimer's disease. And with a similar concept, but on a much larger scale, the European Prevention of Alzheimer's Dementia is a European-wide study, which is now active in Sweden and the Netherlands, and soon Germany, we hope, and Spain and France and the UK. Is there anywhere else? Switzerland. And more countries are coming online all the time. And this is much, much more ambitious. The aim is to have a perpetual cohort of 6,000 people being followed up more or less annually. And the idea is that some of these may be then enrolled into interventional trials to investigate a drug or a disease-modifying treatment or a non-pharmacological therapy. And that any people who go off into trials are replaced then from a readiness cohort of 20,000 people, so that there's perpetually 6,000 people in this longitudinal cohort study. And the idea with the intervention trials, or what they call proof of concept trials, are that they'll be adaptive, but also they will use, they won't wait for somebody to develop dementia. They will look at proxy endpoints, so that if something looks like it's not working at all, it can be discarded early on. So initially, it will see whether the intervention has an effect on a biomarker. If it does, it will go on to the next stage and see if it has an effect on a cognitive outcome. And if so, then it will be look to see whether actually we need to look at this in a phase 3 trial. So there are points along the way where things can be discarded to hopefully avoid the wastage that happens in a lot of clinical trials at the moment. And the idea is that we build on existing knowledge, derive new knowledge from EPAD, and feed that back into the existing knowledge and learn as much as we can. And finally, a newer development, which is very exciting, is the Scottish Dementia Informatics Platform, which is a research interest register, really comparable to things like the Brain Health Register from the University of California, San Francisco in the US, initially launching in the 4 university cities in Scotland, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen, but aiming to cover the whole of Scotland. And really it will be people who are seen both in memory clinics and hopefully in other contexts as well, will be asked if they're interested in participating in research, and if they are, they'll be recruited onto the register and some details taken. And this will facilitate recruitment to EPAD primarily, but also to other research studies. This is just starting off, but is a really exciting endeavour, particularly because, I mean, even locally, the link between there aren't many people like me who combine clinical practice in old age psychiatry and research, and so the link between the clinic and the research centres is a little tenuous, so we're hoping to improve that. But I know we're not alone in having that problem. And I think that was my final slide, so thank you very much.